Maybe I should bring the mic up. I don't know. But hi, welcome back to the channel. This is a new angle, I guess, somewhat. Trying to mix it up a little bit on this channel because I know I'm always facing the same white wall, and I don't know whether that's interesting for you. It's not for me, so here I am. So before the year closes, I wanted to do a little quick top books of the year. These books are the books that I would want to recommend to people if they would to ask me what were the top books that you've read in the year. But of course, I feel like every book has its own time and space for everyone. So there might be some books I read this year that I might think about more often next year and would like to reflect on or to dwell on much longer. But at this time frame, these are the books that I have been thinking a lot about in the past year. And so reading in 2021 was a really interesting journey for me. I think in 2020 I was reading a lot of climate change books, so really books that specifically talked about climate change. But I was also reading like a lot of different non-fiction. Like I was reading about disability studies. I was also reading generally some feminist books as well. One of my favorite books from 2020 was Feminist City by Leslie Kern, so that was a really big one for me. But this year I think it has been pretty varied. I have found some fiction favorites actually and there's also a quite a range of non-fiction. Some are academic, but I think I've tried to choose books that I feel are a lot more generally accessible, but books that are kind of like gateway books into more conceptual ideas on work, on life, on digital sense of beings and things like that. So I think a lot of these books are books that in between that can expand you or welcome you or introduce you to new fields of thinking that you might not have considered before. At least that's what these books did for me. And the very first book I want to talk about is How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy by Jenny Odell. Should appear somewhere here. So this was a book I read as an ebook, and I did see a lot of people reading it in the year of 2020, and so I picked it up to read in the early parts of 2021. So a lot of people did like the book because they thought it was a self-help book. I really enjoyed the book. I really loved the way it was written. It's exactly the type of creative non-fiction that I superbly enjoy, which is a mix of kind of academic citations, but also a lot of personal thoughts, a lot of personal reflections, and also a lot of questions about the bigger implication of everything. Jenny Odell talks about the attention economy, which is the thing that I think a lot of people were reading this book for, talking about how that today's technology platforms are all about kind of getting the most attention being spent on all these platforms. Basically, you are the product, you the viewer are the product, and all these new technologies, all these digital giants are basically trying to get you hooked to the platforms more and more, and oftentimes to the detriment of the people using them, and instead increasing profits for a very small minority. But what I really enjoy about the way that Odell writes about the whole thing is about acts of resistance. How do you resist an attention economy? That means withholding your attention, that means spending attention in ways that are not accounted for in the digital economy, about kind of reconnecting to nature. I think a big part here was about some kind of ecological thought, which I didn't expect. And circling back to the whole ecological thing, I think it was such a good book to reflect on at the end of the year because it introduced a lot of ecological ways of thinking that I wasn't so aware of at the time. Think about how is it that we could think of ways to connect with one another on digital platforms that aren't such extractive, exploitative relationships, but built on mutual respect and understanding across people and across environments. So that was a really interesting book for me, and it was a great reminder of how resistance can be seen in the act of withholding, or in the act of recentering yourself, embedding yourself within the locality of where you are. Like being local is one act of resisting the attention economy. So I thought it was super great. I really enjoyed the book, and I really loved the whole nature theme that was spread throughout the book as well. I highly recommend it. I don't know, I know some people really don't like it because of the expectations. They really thought it was a book purely based on attention economy and digital economies. If you're someone that only reads these kinds of economic books, you might not understand why there's so much about nature, about ecology, why there's so much about activism in the book. But I do think it's going to become even more pertinent as we move on in the years where, you know, climate crisis is on top of everyone's priorities. The second book that I really enjoyed this year is In the Dream House by Carmen Machado. So this book was highly reviewed, highly raved about in the earlier year as well, which is why I picked it up. And I really thought it was very beautifully written, but beautiful in a kind of tragic way, because it is a sort of memoir that is premised upon abusive relationships, but also exploring the dynamics of queer relationships and abuse within intimate relationships. So I thought that was all very haunting and just really emotional. I think when I read it, it kind of surfaced a lot of very old memories and a lot of old traumas, but it was a really good sense of relief for me, because it really helped to articulate a lot of these very complex emotions that I think come out of these relationships, but you might not know how to express them. And I think the format of the book was really intriguing as well. The book was written in sort of very flashback sort of approach, but it really mimicked the whole experience of getting over a traumatic relationship, in which you kind of see healing in a non-linear fashion. It kind of flashes and it kind of goes, and some parts you're really deep into the details, and other parts kind of pass you by like a blur. And that's exactly how reading the book felt, which really accurately captured the whole feeling of trying to get out of this kind of toxic but still very genuine, loving relationship in some way. So that was a really great book to read. I think even if you're not someone that has been afflicted by trauma in some sort of way, I do think it's a very good glimpse into how trauma can actually be written and expressed, articulated through a creative non-fiction format, which I thought was great, because I think a lot of these kind of books that talk about trauma can be either too clinical or can be too disturbing, and this book really falls in between and really paints a very haunting, but you know, it's a really strong image. I feel like the whole thing gave me a really strong image of basically what the author went through, which is just excellent writing. I do think it has really great writing as well. So that is my second book that I absolutely loved. It's not fun reading, definitely not. It also references a lot of queer theory in some way. That was really great for me as well. I realize I'm really hyping these books up, but these are all just my personal opinions, so if you don't like the book, I'm sorry. Third book I want to talk about is Less is More: How Degrowth Will Save the World by Jason Hickel. I did talk about this book quite a lot, I think in a few of my earlier videos. This book really read a bit more like a manifesto. It isn't anything academically rigorous if you're looking for that. It doesn't really give you a very tight economic theory or reasoning. It's more of a convincing, persuasive tone that the author takes on. The author is an academic, and I think what the author is intending to do is to really try and reach the mass audience, like really try to reach the masses in trying to make the idea of degrowth much more accessible and to make it make sense, you know, basically. Hickel does link degrowth movements to the climate justice movement and to all sorts of movements, basically saying that it is the way against neo-imperialism, against capitalism, and basically the way forward, because it's a matter of time and not really a matter of like whether we choose it or not. So I thought it was really great to read. It opened my eyes and gave me a lot of great terminology to really understand what degrowth as a term really meant. The next book I want to recommend is what I have over here, the Entangled Life: How Fungi Make Our Worlds, Change Our Minds, and Shape Our Futures by Merlin Sheldrake. So I did mention this in my books being ecological video, I think, about how this book really reminded me of the fascination with science that I had when I was much younger. So I used to be an absolute science nerd, and I used to read a lot of science magazines, a lot of science books. I would like read encyclopedias for fun. So that was the kind of kid I was, and this book really brought back that sense of awe and wonder at the world. And it's kind of crazy how fungi is an entire like field of study that we don't really know that much about. And what I really love about the whole fungi study thing is that amateurs really rule it. I mean, there's just so much amateur scientists getting on with the whole field and trying to understand what mushrooms do, what fungi does. I don't know, but it's really, really a great read. It was so fun, it was so entertaining, and I think this can be a great gift or a great present or a great recommendation for anyone that feels like they can't read science or feels like they are at loss with nature, or feels like they can't really relate to anything that's not human. I feel like this will be a great book that will spark an interest in how intriguing our world really is. I really enjoyed the very positive tone of this book as well. It's very solution giving, and it does really show the best sides of humanity, where people are innovating using much more sustainable materials, using what nature has already offered us. I mean, did you know that mycelium could be used to make bricks, which could then be used to make our houses? You know, now it's already being used as sustainable packaging, so that's really great. And I love that. I mean, there's some pictures here you can see. Isn't that crazy? The next book I want to talk about is Raffles' Renounced Towards a Merdeka History, edited by Alfian, Faris, Joraimi, and Siew. Now, this is a book about Singapore, so if you're not a Singaporean audience, this might sound a bit too like niche for you, but it is one of my favorite books of the year, precisely because it does talk about a super important part of Singapore's history that I don't think any non-fiction title has really done, in the aspect of like appealing to a bigger audience or more of a general audience. Of course, it does sound a little bit more academic in some places, because some essays are definitely a lot more like historical inquiry kind of essays, but there are also conversations with artists, as well as kind of, you know, reflections in a more personal tone by different writers in this one. There is a very lively discussion on colonial history in Singapore in the academic circles, but really, if you ask the average Singaporean, I don't think they really think much about its colonial history, and instead they do kind of glamorize it in some way. So I don't know what to feel about that, but this book really does help to, you know, inform more of a general audience about the kind of implications of glamorizing our colonial past in some way. The next book is also a Singaporean book, and I actually wanted to put more Singaporean titles in this video, but I did want to keep it a little bit more general. And I was choosing between this and Sufyan Hakim's The Minorities, which I also have a copy of. I'm sure that not all the essays would appeal to everyone, but I really, really enjoyed the essays that talked about intimacy, kinship, in relation to automation, and in relation to kind of like AI, artificial intelligence, figuring out like how can AI actually replicate the idea of kinship and the idea of intimacy. These essays are also all based in a more Malay context here in Singapore, which I think is great, because honestly I don't think I've read a lot of like Chinese Singaporean works in Singapore, but I really, really enjoy reading more about centering Malay experiences within the Singaporean narrative. One of my favorite short stories here is called Anak Ibu, which has the A and the I in brackets because that spells AI. And this short story is about how there's this person that's attending a psychiatrist session, counseling session, I guess, with a psychiatrist who's an AI, and then there's just this increase in tension between the two figures, and this kind of ambiguity between what the AI is saying and what the person is saying, and there's this like climax at the end that makes you question like, oh my goodness, like did the AI already plan everything out beforehand? Did the AI actually predict all of this humans' behaviors and actions before the human took any of those actions? Was it able to predict all of those accurately, or was it just kind of lying and deceiving the human into believing that all of their actions have already been pre-planned and pre-programmed. So that was a really interesting short essay for me to think about, and I think because of that, there's a whole bunch of essays here that gave really great thought in terms of a Singaporean context as well. So because of that, I chose this book as one of my top favorite books this year, because I definitely wanted to have some Singaporean fiction in my recommendations, and this would be my top pick for that. Now, the next book is The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable by Amitav Ghosh. So this is a book that I've talked so much about on my channel. I did talk about it in my video talking about the role of literature in climate change and talking about the climate crisis, and this book was the whole entire reason why I made that video. And I feel like it's such a great book. I feel like more people should read it because it does talk about the role of the humanities and of artists and of thinkers in helping to understand the climate crisis, helping to articulate the climate crisis, and getting more people involved and more people to be aware of the climate crisis. Amitav Ghosh doesn't really come necessarily from an environmental point of view. I think he really does come from a literary point of view, which is great because I think a lot of what we're missing in the climate crisis discourse is how everyone else can have a take on it in your own kind of specialized field. So for someone who is much more of an expert in literature, who can take on a more literary critique on climate crisis and to offer solutions as to how we might better imagine the world, the environment, better imagine stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves and and the environment, that has been really useful in understanding why is it that people have been really reluctant to come to terms with the climate crisis. One of the best applications I guess I've seen of Amitav Ghosh's critique is Tales of Two Planets, I think, which I will put the full name below. It is a collection of short stories, essays, reflections talking about how is it that people across the world can start to really take control of the stories that they tell about themselves and the world in terms of the environment. So that was a really great understanding and application moment for me when I read The Great Derangement, and then afterwards I read a couple of climate fiction, and also thinking about how is it that we can talk about climate crisis in a way that appeals to everyday senses. Great Derangement is a great book. It does talk about imperialism and colonialism. It also talks a lot about capitalism as well. And the great thing about it is from a literature point of view, which is great for all of you people who struggle to find the link between the social sciences, the humanities, and the climate crisis. If you are someone who's interested in using all these storytelling formats to make a difference, I do think that this book is a wonderful book to pick up and to introduce to everyone as well. The next book I want to talk about is The Refusal of Work, Rethinking Post-Work Theory and Practice by David Frayne. This entire book is talking about the concept of work, and it's divided very cleanly into 3 parts. The first one is talking about the history and the kind of theoretical background context of work, as in dating to the previous century. So it doesn't talk about the entire history of work, it talks more about the modern invention of work. The second part, it does kind of talk to many different people who have resisted or refused formal structures of employment. So, hi, this is Editing Net, recording the day after I filmed the whole video. I realized that the second portion of my review for The Refusal of Work has gone missing. This has never really happened before, so I am just gonna give my quick second part review for the book. If you want to see more of an in-depth review, you can check out my other video talking about anti-work, because I did talk about the book in far more length in that video. But anyway, the last part of the book is actually kind of a solution-giving portion that the author wrote, talking about ways that we can very actively move towards a healthier discussion on work and kind of like what we all can do on our very own individual basis. But I also feel like it does talk a little bit more about what we can do as a collective. Again, the sentiment is that we all have to chip in some way, we have to organize in some ways, but this is definitely hindered by a lot of things in a lot of different contexts, especially where I'm from. It is quite difficult to get out of this very individualistic take on work and employment. So that's a huge hurdle for me to overcome. But I do think that the book generally is really great for people who don't really understand the whole discussion on work nowadays, because I do think it is written in a very accessible manner and has really, really relevant points throughout the entire book. It is kind of like an all-in-one. People who are skeptical about all these anti-work discussions may be a bit more convinced by this book. People who also want to know a little bit more about the history or context of the whole discussion on work will also find this book pretty helpful. Overall, I found the book a really great middle ground for a lot of discussions that are happening about work, and I kind of wish that there was a little bit more discussion on various forms of employment that felt more empowering. I think the people that the author focused on didn't really seem very empowered by me. A lot of them seem to be in these positions of semi-employment or not working for various reasons that were not very consciously chosen. Only a few people really consciously chose it, but even then it seemed that their lives were quite severely affected in a few negative ways. I guess this is kind of the limitation of this book, and I do think that there are a lot of people out there who have very successfully resisted all these very institutional forms of employment and are doing a really great job. I wish that there could be more of these stories, and hopefully to kind of empower more of us to really question and push back on what conventional work might mean to a lot of us. And yeah, let's get back to the video. I'm so sorry that all these mishaps keep happening, but cool. And I hope you enjoy this various format thing. Yeah. Bye. See you in the next video. The next book I want to talk about is The Day the World Stops Shopping, How Ending Consumerism Saves the Environment and Ourselves by J.B. MacKinnon. This is a super random book. I don't know where I found it. I think on some ebook catalog. And I picked up this book because I was thinking about the gap in consumption, right? How do we deal with consumption? Because now we still live in a world where consuming is still the number one thing that everyone is encouraged to do in order to keep the economy going. It's about consuming more and more and more. So I'm wondering, how do we move from a consumer-based economy, market world to one that's not based on consumption but based on many other so-called non-consumer activities where things may be transacted for free or things could be repaired over a long period of time. This book, I'm putting it in my top list because I find it to be one of the most accessible books I've ever read about consumption, and it's talking about it in a much more journalistic manner, so it does appeal much more to a mass audience. Because I've been finding a lot of books about economic theory, and the thing about economic theory is that it may be fun and interesting to figure out all these ways of planning and designing markets, but it never really beats being able to understand how people are doing it on the ground, especially people who are on the margins of the economy, that where people have no choice but to adapt and to showcase really brilliant innovations in a way that they can move past a consumer society. This could be seen in societies that are forced to move past the whole consumer demand thing. Maybe they don't have the capacity to do it, or maybe it is way too detrimental to the economy to do so. So I find that this book really does give really great examples throughout all sorts of scenarios in the world. So there's also a chapter on manufacturers, there's also a chapter on an aging population, there's a chapter on basically all sorts of things that are related to consumer behavior, consumption, and it's told in a much more storytelling way, which is what we talk about, I guess, with regards to creative nonfiction. So it does talk about everyday people, does talk about very, very realistic solutions that one could apply in your neighborhood right now, which is what I find so great about this book, that it offers a lot of possibility, a lot of solutions that are really existing or can be existing in the next day or next year or next 5 years, which I struggle to find when I read books that talk a lot about theoretical ways of disrupting something, where you don't really know what the time frame is. You feel like it could take maybe 50 years or 100 years to actually make a change in a theoretical way, on a political system way. Whereas a lot of the things that are mentioned in this book are things that people have been implementing on a small scale but throughout the world, which I think is a lot more of a feasible way of going about trying to reduce consumption in the world. So that's that book. And the last book I want to talk about is a novel. Actually, I did want to include a novel in my top list because I want to recommend a novel. I feel like that's basically what every booktuber does, and I want to recommend a novel because I still think that novels are a great way of immersing yourself in another world and seeing a new way of possibility. The Man of the Compound Eyes by Wu Ming-Yi, in line with what I felt about the whole year, thinking about climate fiction and thinking about the way that we see the environment, this book stands out more to me. So this book is kind of a near future book set in Taiwan. It is by a Taiwanese author. It talks about the clash between sort of indigenous cultures and the human world. Not saying that the indigenous people are not human, but rather it is also a relationship that the author wants to study, in which there are groups of people that have never really touched the human world and have their own thoughts about the environment. It has their own way of admiring and being inspired by the environment, which then the human protagonist learns and understands from. And I loved how it had very strong environmental themes, because I know some people might find that novels with strong environmental themes can be a bit too preachy, but I feel that by this point we can't afford to make critiques on books being too preachy, because literally environmental issues are pretty important. So I would rather novels and authors be much more explicit about their intentions in bringing up environmental themes than to go about talking about them in such vague and symbolic ways that no one actually gets the message. So yes, we are finally at the end of the entire video. I hope you enjoyed it. These are the books that I've chosen as my top books for 2021. As I mentioned earlier, these books, I wouldn't say they're like super amazing, like my all-time favorites. These are the books that I've chosen as those I would like to recommend based on how I felt about them at the end of the year. So thinking about my whole year in review, if any of these books that I mentioned are also your top favorites, do comment down below what they are. Or if you find that there's some books that you really enjoyed this year that you think I'll enjoy, do share them with me as well. I mean, I always love knowing more about different books I could read, and I think for me, finding books is a pretty organic process. A lot of these books I kind of stumbled upon them, and I hope that we can all also kind of do that, find more of these little books in random corners in bookshops and in the library, of course. That's it for me. I think this will probably be the last video I'm uploading for the year. Thank you so much for joining me for the entire year. If you've been watching my channel, it's been great seeing how my content has been received by all of you, and to see how many people have been enjoying the books that I've shared, or just all my rambles. I mean, honestly, I'm still kind of amazed that so many of you enjoy my rambles. I'll keep rambling for all of you. So another small announcement, I did actually relaunch my podcast. I did run a podcast called Gula Melaka for a while since 2020, but I decided to bring it back because I know a lot of you enjoyed the audio format so much more. So I'm thinking of uploading much more casual thoughts and conversations over there. So do let me know what kinds of topics you want me to cover in my podcast down below as well. And I will be doing an advice column every month as well. So that's gonna be super interesting. I have more information about that, I think, in the next few videos once I have planned everything out. If not, yeah, I hope you're having a good holiday season, spending time with your loved ones. Please take care. It's not an easy month for a lot of you, and I do hope you're taking care, especially for those of you who are affected by the floods in Malaysia and in the Southeast Asia region. I send my huge condolences if you have lost your... I mean, if it's just a major loss for everyone, and I hope that you're staying safe, dry and warm wherever you are. And thank you so much for being here with me today. I hope that you all will take care till the next year, and I'll see you again with lots more books and lots more good vibes, I hope. And stay safe, just hold on, we're almost at the end of the year. So thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye. Take care, please. Drink water. I'm gonna drink water right now.